Well, this is a short film about how to mix plaster and how to make a very simple mould and a very simple plaster cast. I'm going to show you how to make a press mould, which is probably the simplest way to cast plaster. You can use almost anything for a press mould. Anything that will give you a texture or give you some interesting surface quality that will be registered in the plaster cast. So I've got a clay tool, a few implements, an old bicycle chain, some seashells, anything that will give a nice interesting quality of texture. I've also got a piece of mesh which will strengthen the plaster cast, because plaster is brittle and it doesn't have any strength in itself, so you need to reinforce the cast that I'm going to make. I've also got a bowl of water, preferably warm, so that it sets quicker. And I've got a bag of ordinary casting plaster, which has to be kept bone dry. And I'll show you how to mix that in a few minutes. So firstly, I've got myself prepared a nice thick sheet of clay with, as you can see, 4 slabs of clay which will form a wall. And the wall will contain the wet plaster, so that when it's drying it doesn't leak out of the sides. It's about 2 inches thick, which will give you a nice thickness of plaster. The clay itself is about ½ an inch thick, so that it will take a good bit of texture and pressing. So the press mold, the clues in the name, you simply, whatever you have, for example a shell, you can simply press it into the surface of the soft clay, and when you remove it, you leave an impression. And this is a negative, if you like, and so whatever I press into the clay will form a positive plaster cast. So effectively anything that I push into the surface of the clay, such as maybe my fingers, whatever I choose to make a composition, I've got a drill bit here which will show up, anything like this will form a positive. So I'm using things like an old bicycle chain, making a number of impressions, and obviously depending on what you want to do with the clay, you can even draw into the surface. So I've got a clay tool here, I'm just dragging it along to make a drawing, if you like, into the surface. Anything you can lay your hands on will register, as long as, and this is quite important, that you don't have what's called an undercut, and that's anything that will grab hold of the plaster and make it difficult to remove the plaster from the clay, because once the plaster's set you need to be able to peel off the clay so that you've got your clean cast. Obviously there'll be some residue of clay that you'll have to wash off later. So if you like, here's just a very rudimentary cast series of impressions. I might add a few more seashells, and that is essentially what a press mould is. What's also worth pointing out is if you wanted to build anything up off the surface of the clay, you can do. So I've got a number of bits of clay. If you wanted to, say for example, add a ridge of clay or any kind of surface quality that projected up towards you, that will form effectively a negative in the plaster cast. So you'll have things extending out and recessing as well. So you might want to add clay to make interesting surface textures, and you can build up the clay with whatever, to however deep you want it to be. So I've used a number of things to make impressions, and I'm now ready to mix my plaster and pour the plaster into the mould. So once I'm satisfied with the composition, I simply use the clay that I've pre-prepared, and I form a number of walls. And to do that, I simply just push the clay against the edge, like so, and along the long edge. So I've got a very, very simple wall. I'll make sure I pinch it so that it doesn't fall apart. So pinch each corner. You could also use a piece of wood, a piece of metal, anything that will contain the plaster. You might even want to use packaging or anything that you could wrap around it to form a nice barrier. So there I've got my impressions, I've got my negative impressions, I've pushed into the clay, I've even built up clay as well. and I'm ready to mix the plaster. So over here, the best thing to use is a bowl that's flexible. If you don't have a plaster bowl like this, which is rubber and flexible itself, you could just cut the rim off a bucket or a Tupperware bowl, and that will give you a flexible container. The reason for that is once we've used up your plaster, the residue that's on the side can simply dry off. You don't need to clean it out, and it will crack out into the bin once you're done. So with my warm water, I've got about half a bowl, just under half a bowl of water. Often the mistake people make is with mixing plaster, they often put too much water in, and the plaster never thickens and sets because it's too watery. It's always better to have too little water than too much, and you can always add plaster to plaster. So even if your initial plaster cast needs some more plaster added to it and it's gone dry, you can always add more plaster to it. It doesn't matter. So the second thing to remember is when you're mixing plaster, don't drop a whole wad of plaster into the water, because all that will happen is it'll form a lump. So you simply just sprinkle the plaster in. You don't have to be too delicate, just sprinkle it in, like so, let it fall through your fingers. And the first rule about mixing plaster and when to know you've got the correct consistency is when, depending on whatever amount of water you've got, you need to look for an island. So you've got to look for an island forming in the surface of the water, that's forming on the surface and it's not disappearing away. So think volcanic islands. And the island you need to have needs to be just over half the surface area. So as you can see, the plaster is very, very thirsty. It's drawing up the water, and the water's soaking away into the plaster. And I've started to see an island that's not disappearing, although it's not under half the surface area, so I'll just sprinkle a little bit more on there. And you can leave it. You can just let it soak in and prepare yourself with the other bits of equipment I'll need, which is the mesh to reinforce the plaster. And just to check, do another check, make sure your walls are secure, and if there's any additional changes you need to make to the surface of the clay, you've got time to do that. And if you wanted to add any more impressions, then you've got time, plenty of time to do that. The plaster won't suddenly set, it does take time. But as you can see, I've got a nice island forming there, and it's important that you don't mix the plaster too early because you'll get lumps. So it's nice and soaked in, and this is where I start mixing. And another thing to look out for, another way to check that you've got the correct consistency of plaster once you've mixed it, is it needs to have the consistency of thick double cream, if you like, or yogurt, okay, natural yogurt. And it needs to be runny, but not too runny that it's watery, and not so thick that it won't move into any of the delicate details that you've got impregnated into the surface of the clay. So I'm now mixing the plaster really, really well. There will be lumps, so just make sure you've got use your hands. It's a really grubby job, this. So make sure you don't have any jewellery on, and try not to have try and make sure that if you've got false nails or nail varnish on, that you've got something to cover them over, or you can wear latex gloves if you like. So I've got my plaster here. So the first thing I remember was to look for the island forming in the surface of the water. The second thing was that the plaster needed to be the consistency of cream or yogurt. The third thing to check, and this is fail-safe, if you put your hand into the plaster, and it doesn't run off your fingers, it just maybe drips 1 or 2 times. If it doesn't run off, then you've got the right consistency. So as I dip my hand in, it's not really running off, it's just hanging off the end of my fingers. It drips every now and then, and that's a perfect consistency. So if I take the plaster over to the clay, all I'm simply going to do is, and it's important that you don't just pour it in straight away. The reason for that is that you could get air bubbles. Notice I've got the clay on a board, and this will be apparent. The reason for this will be apparent in a few minutes. All I'm going to do is just sprinkle an initial layer of plaster into the surface. Okay, so it's just sprinkling it on so that it gets into all the cracks and crevices and grooves and textures that I've made for myself. Okay, just one little layer, just like that. Okay. The next thing I need to do is to make sure that just to reinforce the point about not having any air bubbles, I just want to tap the board, and this will bring any surface bubbles to the surface of the plaster and away from the texture I'm trying to achieve. It's a very delicate surface. If it's a very delicate texture, I don't want to have any air bubbles. So all I do is just knock it a few times, and you can probably see the air bubbles rising to the surface. Okay? And then, once that's achieved, I just add a little bit more plaster, like so. Almost to the top of the clay. Give it a tap a few times. Add the reinforcing metal. So there's a good thickness of plaster between the metal and the clay. I'll sprinkle a little bit more plaster on. Tap it a few more times. And now all I need to do is leave that for about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the heat of the water and the conditions of the room you're in. If it's warm, it'll dry quicker. If it's cool, it'll just take a bit longer to dry off. You'll also notice I've got newspaper with me. My hands are covered in plaster. Before you wash your hands in the sink, it's really important you get as much plaster off your hands as you can with newspaper, because plaster and plugs just don't go well together, and you'll block the sink, and it'll block the plumbing. So try and wipe as much off as you can, because as you can see, it's pretty messy business. You haven't got very much on your hands now. I can then go and wash my hands in the sink. And effectively, that's all you need to know about making a press mould, mixing up plaster and casting. And once this is dry, I'll unpeel the clay and show you what I've achieved. Okay, welcome back. The plaster's dry now, and I'm going to take away the walls. And all you need to do is peel the walls away. And if it doesn't come off the surface, which it should do, then you just simply need to turn the board over and tap the plaster off. Can you see I've just switched the plaster onto its back so the clay's on the top, and all I do is peel off the clay to reveal the press mould. Remember the piece that I had placed on the surface of the clay that was sticking up off the surface? That now becomes a negative, and all the pieces I pressed into the clay have become positives. So they effectively stick up out of the surface, and you can see all those lovely textures that I've made, the shells and my fingerprints. Plaster, if you mix it well and pour it well, picks up any details you put in there. And all I need to do is wash that, and you have yourself a press mould.